Hello and welcome back to the Toffee Blues YouTube channel, your source for all things Everton. My name's Thomas, back on the channel today to talk about the NSNOW campaign, obviously transition from the 27 years campaign. Going to be talking all about Farhad Moshiri, his recent interview on TalkSport, his open letter to the fans, our thoughts about it, and the man who, of course, has joined me today, taking the time from his busy schedule, the star of radio, the Esk, or Paul. Paul, thank you very much for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. I wouldn't call myself the star of radio in any sense. It's just, I think, really interestingly, the campaign that sort of re-engineered itself before Christmas has just been galvanised by the performance against Brighton. I think the Brighton game was when sort of the scales fell off many supporters' eyes, and they could see one team that was represented. I guess we're going to talk about this, but they could see one team that was run by a not very well, or that represented a not very well run club, and they could see one team that was represented rather, a really well run club. And problem was that Everton was the one that's not very well run, and Brighton are the ones that are. And I think since that, probably like 15 minutes at the beginning, or 6 minutes at the beginning of the second half, it's just gone bonkers. And fans who for years have not wanted to criticise the club or not wanted to criticise the board now recognise that doing nothing is no longer an option. Anyway, we'll get into that.
Yeah, definitely. We'll start off with the campaign then, because we know last year, especially the 27 years campaign, came to fruition, got big on Twitter. Mixed reactions at times, as you just mentioned. Some fans were still insistent on not criticising the club or the board, just getting behind the team, which was obviously very counterproductive. Worked in the end to keep us up, but shockingly, we now find ourselves in the same situation. But that has now transitioned to NSNOW. There's been a letter published, signed by pretty much all of the fan channels. I'm not sure one that hasn't. But if you'd like to tell us just a bit about that, the people behind it, what's the deal now with this campaign?
I think there's a recognition that the 27 campaign did a few things right, but they did a lot of things which perhaps should have been done differently. And I think sort of towards the back end of last year, there was a recognition that it probably couldn't continue the way that it was, so that we decided that we would change the branding, but more importantly, change the approach and try and become much more inclusive and bring in views and opinions and people from all across the supporter base. So where we've ended up now is we've ended up from a position where people used to say, why would you join the 27 campaign, to why wouldn't you join the NSNOW campaign? And I think we've got a bit of momentum. Started before Christmas, which was great. But obviously, I think since last week, and since we put out that letter to Farhad Moshiri, when we had like about 20 groups that were supporting the letter, now we're well over 100. As you say, there's not really a major social media group now that's not represented. 20 odd official supporter clubs are represented, and hundreds of individuals. We've also now got 2 players who have signed up, and we're looking to increase that. And I think it's because at the end of the day, people are realising that the club is in a fairly desperate state, both on pitch and off the pitch, and that unless Moshiri does something about the board and about the executive team, then we're going to have major difficulties. If he's not prepared to do anything, then perhaps he has to look at selling the club. But that's that's in a sense an almost a different discussion. In the first instance, it's about getting changes within the club that will allow the club to perform better, and hopefully allow the team to perform better.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on there that maybe some of the mistakes of the 27 campaign, and I know that maybe towards the end of last year, especially, there became quite a lot of polarising opinions of people that wouldn't back it, despite the fact that we did need a group that was going to criticise the board and campaign against the terrible ruling that has gone on. And now the unity behind it, now everyone's got on board, whether they already had that last year, or whether that's come from, well, I hope not just the Brighton loss, maybe just all season, but wherever it's come from, it does seem like now we haven't seen more unity against the board as we do now. And that has been effectively summed up by Farhad Moshiri's open letter that he returned to the group. In that, I'm not sure. Obviously, it's quite clear that he almost definitely didn't write that, and whoever was writing that, I'm not sure what the aim was there. Trying to, I don't know, relax tensions, try and make the fans die down a bit. But if we just start on the letter that the campaign wrote, and then Moshiri's reply. I mean, Moshiri's reply, what was that really about? I'm not sure how the club could see how that would actually solve any situation, or I'm not really sure what the aims were of that letter.
I genuinely don't know. I mean, the letter that we sent, the letter that Moshiri put out last night or yesterday wasn't a reply to us. It was a reply to the fans forum, which one could argue is a bit of a mistake. Anyway, you should have addressed it to all fans, not just the fans forum. But anyway, it doesn't really matter, I suppose. The real, the content, it just doesn't seem to work for me on so many different levels. He talks about the fans taking part in the selection of managers. Not sure that ever happened. He talks about still having confidence in the board and the executive when there's absolutely no grounds for that confidence from our point of view. And I think ultimately it just demonstrated that here's a man who, for whatever reason, is completely out of touch with the realities of the situation, and that he's essentially saying, because the board are locals, because the board have been around for a long time, because they know the club, they know the city, they are the correct people to be running the football club. It just, none of it really makes sense. And it seems to me that one, he's out of touch with how we feel as fans, and two, how the club is. But three, it also suggests that he's not giving anything a great deal of attention. So whatever attention, whatever time he has to run his business affairs at the moment, it seems to me that Everton don't form a huge part of them, because if they did, he would recognise the difficulties that the club have and how different the club actually is from how he described it, and how different the board is from how he described it. So I said this morning on TalkSport that, I actually thought this was I said it was the most disturbing interview I'd heard from a club owner ever, certainly from an Everton club owner, because it just points to somebody that, as I say, doesn't have a handle on things, doesn't seem overly concerned with the issues that we face, and doesn't want to address or change anything that would make things better. So it's really very concerning time, I think, for the club.
Yeah, very concerned, definitely. And that, I mean, we'll call it delusion. I think that's what it is at the point, whether he can see the issue and doesn't want to fix it, or genuinely believes there's no problem at the club. I think it was summed up perfectly by the last line that I've just pulled up here, that the focus of myself, the club, and the fans is aligned. I mean, that is just that itself was a damning statement in that letter that obviously nobody took well to. He seems to think that these open letters that he writes, I mean, the first one obviously went out on club channels. This kind of obviously I don't think the club tweeted it. This just appeared on my feed anyway. That he seems to think that his communication is very effective with the fans, and he seems to think that's almost something that he does well. And when he said, maybe I think it was last year, that he was no longer going to communicate through TalkSport and Jim White, a year on, well, less than a year on, here we are now, and he's done it again in that interview that you said this morning, that maybe as Everton fans, we seem to be the only ones who kind of see how terrifying that is, because as you full well know, we keep getting told, look, spending loads of money, the new stadium's coming. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on the new stadium, but we'll get to that in a bit. But just generally, I think he is completely detached genuinely from what is going on at the club, which is the most terrifying part, and that he doesn't seem to think there's anything wrong in his constant backing of the board. And it's pure speculation, but in your opinion, maybe do you think he's maybe lost interest in the club? Do you think maybe he's waiting for the stadium that he can then sell the club as a more kind of attractive prospect? What do you think the problem is now?
I think the most telling thing that he said, before I answer your question, was that I've put my hand in my pocket. What was it? I put my hand in my pocket. What more can I know and I do?
Yeah, that's all the NONO could possibly do is just spend money left, right, and centre.
That's just remarkable, especially given the paucity of talent that we have in the boardroom and in the executive. So it just shows that the whole club is leaderless and, desperately needs somebody to take control who frankly knows what they're doing, because it didn't appear very much from what Farhad Moshiri's said today that he knows what he's doing. What are his objectives? Well, it's clear that he's had to spend an awful lot more money on the stadium than he had originally thought. With confirmation now that the costs are around about 760 million. I know some people said that, well, he talked to the Shareholders Association in the summer and indicated that that was likely to be the case. But it means that A, he spent more money than he thought he would, and B, we're still looking for a huge chunk of that money in order to finish the stadium off, without any evidence of where that's coming from. And, I talk to people in finance in the US where they've been looking for the money, and there's not a lot of enthusiasm for either lending, or investing in Everton, particularly under the terms that Farhad Moshiri wants. So it's a real struggle and a real puzzle. And if again, an area of concern is if Farhad Moshiri thinks that the letter that he put out yesterday, and if he thinks that the response that he made this morning on Jim White's program is going to help him raise funds either from investors or from lending institutions, banks, etc. I think he's wrong, because it just didn't come across as professional. It didn't come across as somebody that had a grip of the situation. It didn't come across as somebody who had a plan. It was somebody who sounded a little irked that he was being questioned as to what his motives were and what he was doing, and irked also that people would almost have the audacity to question how good or not his board was, because of course he talked about having confidence in the board, having confidence at all levels within the club. Yesterday were his words, and to me, I know obviously I'm from the outside, it just feels and looks like somebody that is not at all either well briefed or in touch with reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially talking about the kind of the manager merry-go-round, that he said that all the managers who have left have been driven by the fans, not by me initially. I mean, that is a terrifying concept, really, and that either as an owner, you shouldn't let the decision go to the fans. You should obviously take into that into account when you make that decision. I wish he'd done that before Benitez was hired. Anyway, I'm not really sure how that statement saying that the fans have driven the decisions on managers, where I think it was very clear everyone's perspective before Rafa Benitez was appointed, and just statements like that, it clearly just shows how detached he is at this point, and it is terrifying, because even with all the talk on Twitter, with the work that the campaign are doing, it gets to a point where you wonder, will this all work? Of course, you've got to keep going, you've got to persevere through it, but it does seem to be terrifying that he just doesn't seem to have any sort of notion on just quite how bad things are getting.
Yeah, to be fair, I thought perhaps that the comments about the fans and the managers might have been more towards the fans having influence over when managers leave the club as against when managers come in. But then, the only person that should be leading the selection of managers is not Farhad Moshiri. It should be a director of football. Now, I know that, for example, we didn't have a director of football when Frank Lampard came in last year, because Selwell came in after him. But we have done on previous occasions where Moshiri has, overrode whatever the wishes and desires of whoever the director of football was at the time. So it's clear to me that he still thinks of himself as the principal person in terms of selecting managers, regardless of whether we have a DOF or not. And also, I thought if it was the fact that the fans are a key part in getting rid of a manager, it demonstrated a degree of weakness that you wouldn't normally want to see in somebody in his position. I mean, he should have confidence in the people that he selects, and then hold that confidence throughout. The fact is, if indeed the fans were responsible or influenced his decisions, it's because he made the wrong decisions in the first place. It's not because the fans have willingly taken a dislike to somebody. It's just because the recruitment decision in the first instance was wrong. And that's down to the fact that he doesn't use his director of football in a proper way, which then gets back to the whole thing about governance and about how the club is run, and how he dips in and he dips out when he wants to. And it's just we've said it or rather I've said it and other people have said it increasingly in recent months, possibly years for me. It's just indicative of a club that's very, very poorly run. It doesn't have a structure. There's no proper chain of command. There's no proper responsibilities. People aren't authorised to do things that they should be able to do in the positions that they hold. And that all comes down from Farhad Moshiri in allowing it to happen, but it comes down from the chair and the board for allowing those situations to continue, which, ultimately is why we're doing what we're going to do on Saturday.
Yeah, well, tell us a bit more about that. What, in case people haven't seen it on Twitter or haven't seen it on any of the social media, what are the plans for Saturday, and how can fans get involved?
Well, essentially there's two plans. One of which NSNOW is obviously very heavily involved. The other one we fully support, and it's been organised by the 1878 group. So there's the meet and greet of the coaches before the game, which I think is good. And given the importance of the game and given what's likely to happen after the game, it's important to demonstrate again the fan support. There should be no question as to whether or not Evertonians support the Everton football team. As in, like Jim White, for example, asking me this morning, do I support Frank Lampard? Well, he's the manager, so I have to support him. So the greet is going to be very important, because I think that sets the tone for the game. And obviously during the game, I think the team will be fully backed like normal. But at the end of the game, what we're asking for is for people to stay for 15 to 30 minutes after the game, remain in the seats if there's large numbers of people staying. And it's going to be all around the ground. It's not just going to be a few hundred people in the Gladys Street. We are anticipating large sections of the ground, large sections of the crowd in different parts of the ground to remain in their seats. There's been a crowdfunding, which people might know about, which is nothing to do with or NSNOW as we call ourselves. That raised over £5,000. So there's dozens and dozens and dozens of banners that are going to be placed around the ground, and people are asked to hold them in prominent positions so that the press can take photographs and the TV cameras can pick up the images. I understand from the club that the stewards are going to be instructed to allow the banners to be flown wherever, and that they will do everything they can do to facilitate the protest. And I think from our side as NSNOW, what we would ask of fans is, first of all, obviously for as many fans as possible to participate in this, but secondly also to recognise the sensitivities around fan behaviour. So the things which the football regulators don't like, and in fact some of the things which are now illegal in football grounds, such as pyros and throwing objects onto the pitch, we don't want to see any of that. If you're going to do pyros, do them outside the ground at the coach greet, and that's fine, and I think the club are okay with that. But inside the ground, first of all, it's illegal. Secondly, it puts the person who's doing it at risk, because they may face a ban, could be as much as a life ban for doing so. And it puts the club at risk at the end of the day, because the Premier League are now looking for these incidences, and they're going to penalise clubs heavily for doing it. We got fined £300,000 for the Crystal Palace game at the end of the season. So it's important that people behave responsibly and stick to the rules, whether you agree with the rules or not. but it's equally important that the fans are engaged and tell the board and tell Farhad Moshiri in particular, because this is addressed to Farhad Moshiri at the end of the day, not the board per se, that we have to have change. And what is that change? Well, it's either bring in a fresh executive team, bring in a fresh chair, bring in a fresh board, or if you're not prepared to do that, sell the club. Because the thing that I think we all recognise now, doing nothing is no longer an option. And I think that's one of the big differences between a year ago and now, that people now recognise that we've gone as far as we can go with the people who currently run the club. And if that's not recognised by the owner, then the owner has to sell to somebody else who does recognise that. And people say, well, how's that going to help the fight against relegation? In the first instance, there's not an obvious reason how it could, other than a change in chair, a change in board, bringing fresh people in, would, how can you put it? It would change the culture of the club. Mm-hmm. And I think the change of the culture of the club, the change of outlook of the club, the change how the club feels inside would make a big difference to how just as the change in behaviour of fans at the end of last season would make a big difference to how we perform at the end of the season.
So Paul there has just told us all about how you can get involved this Saturday, and I think it is important for fans. I know, saying that from my perspective, I know from yours it is, asking people who are at the match to do things. Maybe some people don't like that, but it is very important now that people do make a stand, when you can. The notion there, stay in the stadium afterwards, greet the coach if you want to. No pyros in the stadium, nothing on the pitch, because not only will that harm the club, but it won't reflect well on the campaign anyway. And it might we know what the media like. They will detract from the actual message of the campaign. But that does pretty much bring me to the end of my thoughts, because, of course, as I mentioned, radio star at the beginning, you've been all over social media recently. Have you got any kind of final concluding thoughts that you'd like to add to the situation, as well as if you could let us know, are you actually excited for the stadium?
Yeah, that was Jim White's question, wasn't it? I think there are more pressing matters at this moment in time. Let's stay in the Premier League at the end of this season, and then perhaps we can return back to the stadium. I just think, in a sense, it's great sadness that we come to this point where the club, where the fans have to unite to such a degree in order to get the club to listen to them, and for the club to recognise actually that the current behaviour of the club, the current standards that the club are setting in terms of how they run the business, and the lack of care and attention from the owner leads to this type of behaviour. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, no football fan wants to have to really worry about their football club, or have to be at the point where they actually have to get involved in trying to run the club or trying to get the club to change its behaviour. If the club is run properly, if we were doing the right things, if we were doing the things that better run clubs do that we're not currently doing, none of this would be necessary. And if the club or Farhad Moshiri is listening to this, then that's the message. Let's change the behaviour of the club, change the people, bring better people in, run the club in a better way. And then all of this disappears, and it disappears because we have a club then that represents the club's values. And as NSNOW, where the name is derived from, has a club that represents the values of nil satis nisi optima. And that's what we want as a football club. That's what we want as fans. That's what we've always expected as Evertonians. And it needs to be a return to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is that simple. Although, we're very critical of Moshiri, we, as much as he, will also want to see a return on his investment. And it is as simple as, putting better people in charge of the club, in terms of the directors, as you've touched on before, the system of directors, that they're all executive at the moment. It's bad governance. It's very counterproductive to success on the pitch. And as you touched on at the start, that the dichotomy between ourselves and Brighton, just seeing how a club that's well run, a solid structure, compared to a club as we've touched on now, that is in complete chaos. The results, at the end of the day, we want to see success on the pitch, and that's what the campaign are after. So, Paul, thank you very much for taking time out to talk to us today. Where can our viewers find you if they don't know where you are already?
Just at the Esk, THEESK, on Twitter, or www.theesk.org. That's it.
Fantastic. So thank you all very much for watching. Please do join us next time on the Toffee Blues. Let's hope for, first of all, a good result on Saturday and, successful protest, whatever that success may deem to be. So as I mentioned, thank you all very much for watching and join us next time. Goodbye.